Chapter 5, Blurring Boundaries. I watch wrestling because I like the violence. My friends watch wrestling because of the violence. My friends and I are men. We like violence. Part 1 gave arguments for the theory behind the VSI and its origin, how things are understood through the meaning of symbols, and how that can be applied to the expression of the VSI. Part 2 has been concerned with directly applying this to people surrounding professional wrestling. There are, however, other expressions that raise moral questions society will struggle to answer adequately. In this chapter we study the horror genre and the hostility catharsis. The horror genre. The horror genre is probably the second largest acceptable expression for the VSI, distributed by book and film. Notice the connection with professional wrestling. The horror genre, especially in film, is fictional. No one really gets bitten by a vampire. No one really gets ripped to pieces by a psycho. As with wrestling, there is the suspension of disbelief. We enter into fantasy so that we can get the satisfaction from the VSI. Cinema growth in the horror genre mirrors the growth of the VSI. The Enlightenment may well be responsible for the birth of Gothic horror, and secularization for the desensitization to violence we now have. History of the Gothic shows its clash against, and one could say birth, from the Enlightenment. If one accepts the thought that everything is rational, one cannot explain the supernatural. The Gothic movement provided a release of fantasy and excitement. Excitement is one of the essential ingredients for the VSI to be satisfied. The Enlightenment took away the excitement of the unknown by asserting that everything could be worked out scientifically. These sort of suppositions are bonds. They create boundaries. Boundaries give rise to a need to escape and break free. Fantasy often deals with the impossible, so the Gothic presented a magical alternative that may be considered as a totally impossible fantasy alternative, and it brings back the possibility of excitement. There is also the additional advantage that Gothic horror allows exploration of the forbidden. This is in matters concerning religion and morality. In discussing the symbolism of pro-wrestling, there was identification with the subjects and their actions. Both the victim, the victor, and the interpretation of the game storyline allowed us to gratify the VSI. It should come as no surprise that the horror genre began by twisting tales of real life, using symbols that the people of the day could clearly understand, but exaggerating these. We also concluded that pro-wrestling can carry a political message, and that it works by dehumanizing the enemy. This is also true with some strands of violent films, particularly the action and war films, where the enemy is portrayed as being evil in a black and white case. The opportunity to gratify the VSI is being presented through nearly all media types. The audience is encouraged to explore what these opportunities offer. American Psycho is a good example of this. The film is set so the audience receives everything from the killer's perspective, and we know what he thinks in social situations because of the voiceover. It allows the audience to discover on a psychological basis what it is like to be the killer, to go through the motions of his violent actions, and to try and identify with the killer. Of course, the audience hasn't actually done any of the killing, and neither has the killer, for he is an actor. But the themes and symbolism put across are all too obviously real. The curiosity factor, when combined with the VSI, allows us to imitate in our minds and to pretend to do great crimes against society. Crimes that, if done in reality, would result in the death or life imprisonment. The central theme besides the killing is the display of an obsessive personality. Can this be considered a signpost that there is a link between the obsessive and the VSI? This will be examined in Chapter 6. With regard to films such as American Psycho, and there are a number of them like this, one has to ask, first, what is the moral question here? Of course, the audience hasn't done anything wrong, but psychologically, surely there is a part of their curiosity that is excited and rewarded for seeking out this violence. As they have done nothing wrong, they take no consequences for what they have seen. The moral question will be settled in part 3. Secondly, is this really a safe form of escapism? Must we really go to these lengths of witness and pretense to partake in a pretend mock-up of a killing? Some people do gratify the VSI this way. They enjoy the freedom of being able to do anything in fantasy. To cross the boundary of decency and to take the lives of others, they effectively fantasise about it. Yet they never do it in reality, and so there is no moral restraint. They never have to face the consequences of what their actions would cost them were it real. We entertain ourselves by enjoying the biggest crime against society, its destruction through crime and killing. For some, the watching of a horror movie is to prove that they can do it, both to themselves and to earn respect from others. This rite of passage follows human history and development through rites of initiation. In the ancient world, young children would have to undergo the infliction of pain in order to progress through to manhood. Even in cultures who were established and flourished in Anno Domini times, particularly the Maya, Aztec and Inca civilizations, this process was a given. Today we still go through a mirror image of this process. Through watching a film, though watching a film will never physically damage our bodies, like attaching ourselves to trees with nails and hanging for a given time, it is a psychological test of strength, not to be affected by the frightening images. This ancient tradition still continues even though the need for the custom has gone. The horror genre is a last vestige of ancient rites of passage. The great minds on this subject include Wood, Derry, Dickstein and Heller in the mid to late 1980s. From these people's work there came an interest in mapping the history of the horror genre. They found the Gothic Age in full flow by 1930 displayed through early cinema. One can't help but think that the Gothic Age would have begun earlier had the technology been available. There was a need to get the audience to actually identify themselves with the monsters on screen, and so as noted by Hogan and Doherty, effort was made to avoid over-frightening the audience. Frankenstein and the vampire were two horror icons of the time. The horror genre changed very quickly. It came to be far more graphic and bloody. In the 1950s, audiences were aware of zombies, mummies, lycanthropes, larger-than-life insects and aliens. It had already been established that the rush needs to push even higher to get a bigger high to satisfy the VSI. In the 1950s, this became evident within the horror genre. People no longer wanted to always identify with the monster. They wanted to go further. More excitement, more fear. Coinciding with the rise of cinema giants like Paramount, the Hammer horror series kicked off the 1950s with a new reinvented horror. Horror became a taboo breaker of the explicit, violent sex link. Again, notice the link between the expression of the VSI and eroticism. By the 1980s, slasher movies and spiritual horrors had appeared. Thrillers and chillers were to complete the century of the horror genre. To demonstrate how far the VSI has evolved in horror, and how far we have moved away from the Gothic, I recommend a watching of Queen of the Damned, followed by Long Time Dead. This will demonstrate very quickly the gap between what was capable of satisfying the VSI and what is now necessary. Recently, Queen of the Damned got a bit of bad press from a review in Film Review Yearbook, where the message hints of disappointment at the lack of graphic violence. In Queen of the Damned, the portrayal of vampires is extraordinarily noble. The film shows the vampires Lestat and Marius as being almost human, having desires, affected by emotions. The horror is not graphic. Rather, the theme deals with the grandeur, the sublime, old sets of stone houses with vines. Look now at Long Time Dead. A djinn chases a group of teenagers who play the Ouija board. One by one it slaughters them all, in graphic detail, and special effects are very, very frightening indeed. What does this tell us about the growth of this particular expression in less than 100 years? It's all perfectly tolerable to society because it's fabricated and staged.